I found a first number that didn't belong at 11 at night in a building that smelled like engine grease and cold coffee, and I didn't know yet that it was going to get someone killed. My name is Mafia Boss, and 3 hours earlier, I had walked into Callaway Maritime Holdings with a court order in one hand and a legal pad in the other, expecting a boring white-collar case. I did not expect the man they called the ledger to be standing in the lobby, waiting for me himself. Dante Callaway was not what the file photos suggested. The photos made him look like a suit with a jaw, another rich man playing dangerous for the cameras. In person, he had a stillness to him, the kind of quiet you notice in a room full of noise, like he'd trained himself years ago to never waste a movement, never waste a word. He watched me sign in at the security desk the way you'd watch weather coming in off the water, patient and unbothered, like he already knew exactly how the next 10 minutes are going to go and didn't feel any need to hurry them along. I was not there to be impressed. I told him plainly that I had a court order to review 3 years of shipping manifests, that I need a desk, a terminal, and no interruptions, and that I didn't need coffee or small talk or an escort to the bathroom. He smiled like I'd told a joke he'd already heard before and told his assistant to set me up in the small conference room on the second floor. Limited access. Just enough rope for me to find nothing, because as I learned much later, the Real books lived somewhere else entirely, in a set of ledgers that never touched a server I was allowed near. Most auditors who came through that building folded within a week, worn down by the reputation before they ever finished opening a folder. I didn't fold. I have never once in my life been good at being afraid of the right things at the right time, which used to be a compliment before it cost me a promotion, and then a relationship back when I refused to bury a finding for a superior who wanted a clean report more than he wanted an honest one. I learned that year that being right doesn't protect you. It just changes what you lose and how quietly you lose it. So I sat in that conference room with a legal pad and coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, cross-referencing shipping manifests against port records, looking for the kind of small inconsistency that most people would scroll right past, because most people don't spend their careers training themselves to notice them. I have a system. I read every column 3 times before I trusted. And around 10:40 that first night, on my third pass through a stack of manifests I'd already dismissed once, I found one. A manifest number that repeated on a date it shouldn't have, tied to a shipment that, when I traced the routing code back through the Port Authority's public database, didn't belong to Callaway Maritime at all. It belonged to a city account, municipal. Nothing to do with shipping, nothing to do with the company I'd been sent to audit. I sat there staring at the number for a long time, long enough that the overhead light in the empty office building clicked off around me, and I had to wave my hand to trigger the motion sensor again because I understood 2 things at once. The first was that I had probably just found something far outside the scope of my audit, something that belonged to a different case entirely. The second was that I had absolutely no idea yet what it meant, or who it belonged to, or what it would cost me to keep looking at it. I built a career out of that exact feeling, the low hum in my chest when a number refuses to sit still. Most people see a spreadsheet and see rows. I see a story someone is trying very hard not to tell. So instead of packing up right away, I did what I always do, which is the thing that gets me into trouble every single time. I pulled the shipment's insurance rider, cross-checked the weight class against the vessel's manifest, and found a second small inconsistency stacked directly on top of the first one, like someone had built one lie carefully on the foundation of another and hoped nobody would ever bother checking the foundation. If you've ever pulled on a thread without knowing it was attached to something that could get you killed, stay with me, because that's exactly what I did that night, sitting alone in a cold conference room with a highlighter and a legal pad. And I want you subscribed before you find out what happens next, because I promise you this story does not slow down from here. I packed up my legal pad a little after 11 and walked out through the empty lobby, past the same security desk, out into a parking lot lit by sodium lamps that turned everything the color of a bruise. I didn't see Dante again that night, but I heard later, much later, what he said to his second in command the moment the glass doors closed behind me. He told him to find out everything about the auditor, not to threaten me, not to warn me off, not yet, because, in his exact words, I had found something that shouldn't exist, and a man like Dante didn't like things that shouldn't exist sitting out where a stranger with a legal pad could stumble over them. I brought the discrepancy to my supervisor 2 days later, expecting at minimum a nod of approval, maybe a raised eyebrow, some acknowledgement that I'd done good work. I got the opposite. He told me, without even really looking up from his monitor, that it was outside the scope of the audit and that I should stick to the shipping company's own numbers. When I pushed, gently laying the routing code out in front of him, he told me I was overreaching, that I was imagining a connection that wasn't there, and that if I kept pulling on a thread that didn't belong to my case, I could jeopardize the entire prosecution. He said kindly, that was almost worse than if he'd yelled. Being told no by someone who's smiling at you while they say it teaches you something ugly about how institutions actually work and is not a comfortable lesson. I nodded, said I understood, and went back to my desk. I did not drop it. I copied the discrepancy onto a personal drive that never once touched the office network, and on my own time, after hours sitting on my couch with takeout going cold beside me, I started quietly cross-referencing that municipal routing code against public court filings, trying to find where else it had surfaced. It took 3 nights of after-hours work before I found the pattern starting to repeat itself in places it had no business repeating. While I was doing that, somewhere in a part of the city I knew nothing about yet, Dante was hearing something that would eventually connect to exactly what I'd found. An old associate came to him with a problem he didn't want to hear. A courier line had been compromised. Cases that should have stayed buried inside the prosecutor's office were leaking out to a rival organization run by a family named Kovac, and the leak wasn't coming from outside his world at all. It was coming from inside the prosecutor's office itself. Dante didn't know my name yet when he heard that, but he would within the week, and when he did, he'd realize that the irrelevant little discrepancy the new auditor had stumbled onto was the exact same thread his own people were trying to trace from the opposite direction. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that my boss had told me, kindly, to stop looking at something that clearly mattered, and I hadn't listened. If you've ever been told by someone with real authority over you to stop looking at something you already knew mattered, tell me in the comments whether you'd have dropped it or whether you'd have kept digging exactly like I did. Because that one decision is the reason everything that came after happened to me. 3 days after that conversation, my supervisor's assistant copied me, by accident she said, on an internal email thread I was never supposed to see. I read it standing at my own desk, coffee cooling in my hand. It named me directly. It called me a liability that needed to be managed. I read those 2 lines twice, with my hands going very still around the cup, because I understood in that exact moment that someone above me had already decided I was a problem, and I still had no idea who had written those words or how far above me they sat. That was the first time my trust in the place I worked actually cracked. Not broke. Cracked the way a windshield does, a hairline you can still see through if you don't look too closely. I told myself it was probably about budget, about office politics, about anything other than what it actually was. I wasn't ready yet to consider that the crack ran further than my own department. I went home that night and did something I hadn't done since I was a junior auditor terrified of losing my first real job. I printed everything, every file, every note, every version of the discrepancy, and I put it in a fireproof box in the back of my closet, underneath a stack of old tax returns nobody would ever bother going through. I told myself it was just being careful. Some part of me already knew I was building a case against my own office before I'd even let myself say the word leak out loud. A week later, I started noticing a gray sedan parked across the street from my apartment building. Not every night, just often enough that I started counting the nights it showed up, the way you count anything you're trying not to be afraid of. On the 4th night, I walked straight up to the driver's side window instead of pretending I hadn't seen it, because I have never once in my life been good at pretending I hadn't seen something. The man behind the wheel didn't even look surprised to see me coming. He just rolled the window down halfway and told me, politely, that I should have a good evening, like I was a neighbor he passed on stairs. I found out the next morning who'd sent him. It didn't take much digging. I walked into Callaway Maritime without an appointment, straight past the same lobby, straight into Dante Callaway's office, and told him, standing 3 feet from his desk, to call off his man. I wasn't asking. He looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I felt in my spine, and I want to be honest with you, It wasn't the look of a man who was used to being told what to do inside his own building. It was the look of a man quietly recalculating something he thought he already had figured out. He didn't apologize. He told me, carefully in that same unhurried voice, that the discrepancy I'd found connected to something that got people killed, and that he put a car outside my building because he already suspected my own office had a leak days before I'd figured out the exact same thing myself. I didn't believe him. I assumed it was a tactic, a way to make me trust him just enough to steer my investigation somewhere convenient for his own operation. I told him as much, told him I didn't need protecting by anyone, and I left. But something had shifted in that room, even if I wasn't ready to name it yet. He knew something I didn't, and that irritated me far more than it frightened me, because I have never been able to walk away from a piece of information I don't have. If you've ever told a genuinely dangerous man to his face to back off and meant every word of it, hit like on this video right now, because that's exactly what I did that morning, and it did not go the way you'd expect it to in a story like this one. I got home that night, and my apartment door was unlocked. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. On my kitchen table, centered perfectly like it had been placed there with a level, sat a single manila folder containing printed copies of that internal email thread, the one that called me a liability. Someone had been inside my home. Someone who wanted me to know it without ever having to say a word. I stood in my own kitchen for a long time before I moved, keys still in my hand, coat still on. Not because I thought anyone was still there. Because I understood, all at once, standing under my own kitchen light, that this had stopped being about a discrepancy in a shipping manifest. Someone had walked into the one place I was supposed to be safe, touched nothing, taken nothing, and left proof that they could reach me whenever they wanted to. That is a different kind of fear than the kind you get from someone shouting a threat at you across a room. It's quieter than that. It gets into the walls of a place and stays there. I couldn't go to the police. If the leak ran through my own office, I had no way of knowing who I could trust there, or how far up the chain it went, or whose desk that email thread had actually started at. So I went back to Dante, not to confront him this time, but because I needed information, and he was the only person in this entire situation who seemed to actually have any. He confirmed, without hesitation, without even pretending to think it over, that the folder hadn't come from his people, which meant someone else, someone connected to my own office, now knew that I knew. He laid it out for me plainly, no theatrics, no performance, just a methodical accounting of everything he understood about the Kovac leak, said the way you'd explain a mechanical problem to someone who needed to understand it fast. And then he offered protection. I refused, on principle. I didn't want to owe a man like him anything. And worse than that, I was afraid that accepting his help would compromise the integrity of my own testimony later, would hand someone a clean excuse to say I'd been compromised the entire time I'd been on this case. He didn't push. He just told me, quietly, that the offer would still be there whenever I wanted it. That night, alone in my apartment with the locks changed and the manila folder still sitting on my table because some part of me couldn't bring myself to throw it away yet, I finally admitted something to myself that I'd been avoiding for days. I wasn't afraid of Dante Calloway. I was afraid of the people trying to erase me quietly, one small violation at a time, instead of loudly enough that anyone would ever notice. The next threat didn't come with a break-in. It came with a memo buried in a routine internal review, the kind of document nobody reads closely except the person it's written about. I found out, almost by accident, scrolling a shared calendar I wasn't supposed to have access to anymore, that my name had been flagged and that I was quietly being reassigned off the corruption case entirely. My authority on the file, and eventually my job itself, would be on the table if I pushed back too hard. It wasn't a gun pointed at me. In some ways it was worse, because it was aimed directly at the one thing I had left that felt like mine, the career I'd spent years building by refusing to look away from things other people wanted buried and forgotten. Dante, without asking my permission, had a contact quietly surface a second discrepancy that made my reassignment look suspicious on paper, which bought me time without actually solving the underlying problem. I was furious when I found out he'd acted without telling me first. Again, moving pieces on a board I hadn't agreed to let him touch. But for the first time, sitting across from him in that same conference room, I understood the real difference between being controlled and being backed. Control takes your choices away from you entirely. Being backed just means someone is standing behind you while you make them yourself, ready to catch what falls. He didn't offer to fix everything that time either. He just sat with me while I worked through what the reassignment memo actually meant, walking me through which parts were bluff and which parts had real teeth, the way a man reads a contract before he signs it. It was the first time I noticed how careful he was about not doing things for me that I hadn't asked him to do, which was almost more disarming than if he'd just taken over completely. That conversation turned into a longer one than either of us planned, and for once it wasn't about the case at all. He told me, briefly, without turning it into a speech or asking for sympathy, that he'd once had someone working closely with him get killed because he'd assumed he had more time than he actually did. He said he'd built everything about how he ran his operation afterward around never making that exact mistake again. He didn't dress it up. He didn't linger on it. He just said it plainly, let it sit in the room between us for a moment, and moved on. It was the first time I saw him as an actual person operating by his own private code, instead of the idea of danger I'd been warned about before I ever walked into that lobby. He just told me the one mistake he never lets himself make twice, and sitting across from him that night, I had a feeling it was about to happen again, right in front of him. So if you want to see whether he catches it in time, make sure you're subscribed and watching for the next part, because it's coming faster than either of us expected. Working the case together after that felt different, less like a negotiation between two suspicious strangers and more like two people who were actually good at their jobs finally pointed in the same direction. It didn't take long before we found name. A deputy prosecutor named Alan Reyes kept surfacing in the pattern, close enough to the leak on paper that both of us assumed, reasonably carefully, that we'd found our source. I wanted to handle it the right way, through proper channels, the way I'd always done things. So I quietly reported my suspicion about Reyes to the one person left in that office I still trusted completely, my former professor and longtime mentor, Diane Ashworth, now a senior advisor to the district attorney, and, as far as I was concerned, the closest thing I had of family in that building. I told myself I was finally doing the safe thing, the correct thing, going through institutional channels instead of relying on a man most of the city crossed the street to avoid. I remember sitting across from Diane in her office, watching her nod along at all the right moments, watching her write something in the margin of her own legal pad while I talked, and feeling, for the first time in weeks, like I could finally exhale. She'd been the one who taught me how to read a balance sheet like it was confessing something. She'd written my recommendation letter for the state job. If I couldn't trust her, I didn't know who was left. I had no idea I was handing my exact position and everything I'd figured out straight to the person who'd been hunting me the entire time. Diane wasn't just uninvolved in the leak. She was the actual source of it. Reyes was innocent, a convenient scapegoat she'd been quietly building a paper trail against for months, in case anyone ever got close enough to need one to point to. The moment I told her what I suspected about him, I told the one person who needed most to know exactly how close I'd gotten to the truth. Dante was uneasy about her from the very start, and not because he had any proof. Not yet. It was instinct, the kind you build over years of learning to read a room for a living, learning which smiles are real. Something about how quickly she offered to handle everything personally, how eager she was to take the problem off my hands entirely, didn't sit right with him. I dismissed it. I told him it was just territorial distrust of institutions, that of course a man like him didn't trust a respected woman like her. I was proud of my own judgment in that moment. It was the thing I trusted most about myself in the entire world, and it was about to be the exact thing that nearly got me killed. Diane called me 2 days later and asked me to meet her alone, off the record, at a downtown parking structure so we could go over the files safely, away from the office and any prying eyes. She told me she wanted to keep me safe, and I believed her completely. So tell me honestly in the comments if you'd already started suspecting her before I did, because I genuinely want to know how far ahead of me you were sitting there listening. I went alone. I told Dante I could handle this one myself, and I meant it not out of recklessness toward him specifically, but because some stubborn part of me still hadn't fully let go of doing things entirely on my own terms. Diane met me on the 3rd level of that structure, under flickering fluorescent light, kept me talking with vague, warm reassurances about the investigation, and I didn't notice, not at first, that she was stalling for time, watching the elevator over my shoulder while she spoke. Two of Kovac's men moved into position in that structure while she kept me talking. Dante, who it turned out had never fully stood down the protection around me despite my objections weeks earlier, got an alert the moment my phone stopped moving in a dead zone. He arrived with his own people fast enough to intercept, not through luck, not through some impossible coincidence, but because a thin layer of protection had been quietly running the entire time, even after he'd told me, to my face, that he'd back off. What happened next was fast and controlled, and over far more quickly than I expected, tense but never allowed to spiral into real chaos. The kind of extraction where the danger is completely real, but the professionals handling it don't let it become anything more than it needs to be. In the middle of it, for one unmistakable second, I watched Diane's face change. The performed concern dropped away completely, and underneath it was something cold and calculating that had nothing to do with concern for me at all. I understood in that single second, standing in that concrete structure with my heart pounding, exactly who had been hunting me the entire time. She just watched her mentor's mask slip for one single second, and if you're anywhere near as unsettled by that as I was standing in that parking structure, hit subscribe right now, because I promise you this story does not slow down from here. Dante got me out. Diane disappeared into the crowd on the ground level, untouched, unconfirmed, and still, on paper, completely above suspicion. That was the part that scared me most afterward, more than anything that had almost happened to me physically. The fact that she could simply walk away from it clean, unbothered, while I sat shaking in the back of a car. Dante didn't say much on the drive back. He just kept one hand on the wheel and let me sit with it, let me shake without narrating my own fear back to me, which I have come to understand is its own kind of gift, being allowed to fall apart quietly without an audience demanding you explain yourself. It was the first time I let him see me anything less than composed, and he never once made me feel small for it. The wound wasn't abstract anymore after that night. It wasn't institutional betrayal in the vague sense I'd started to feel weeks earlier, some faceless system failing me. It was personal now, sharp and specific. Diane had shaped my entire career from the very beginning. She was the reason I'd become the kind of person who refused to look away from an inconsistency in the first place. And now I had to sit with the fact that the same woman had just tried to have me killed. She moved faster than I expected her to. By the next morning, Diane had already filed an internal report claiming that I was the one who'd been compromised, that I was colluding with a known organized crime figure, feeding him confidential case material, possibly unstable, possibly the actual source of the leak all along. It was a threat aimed at something Dante's considerable resources couldn't simply overpower with force, because it wasn't the kind of threat you could outmuscle. It had to be dismantled with evidence, and with standing, and with patience. I was furious and humiliated in a way that surprised me with how deep it went, how personal it felt to have my own name turned into a weapon. I had to decide whether to let Dante fix it his way, which would work, which I had no doubt would work, but would also quietly confirm every accusation Diane had just put on paper, or find a way to expose her cleanly enough that my own name came out of it intact too, untouched. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I stopped treating staying independent of him as some kind of moral requirement I owed myself, and started treating it as a strategic choice I was making on purpose, with clear eyes and full understanding of what it would cost either way. That shift mattered more to me than I expected it to. We spent that night building a counter case together at 2 a.m, going line by line through everything we had spread across his kitchen table, and it wasn't dramatic. It was just two competent people working a problem side by side over cold coffee. And somewhere in those quiet hours, I realized how much I'd already started to trust him, not because he'd rescue me from parking structure, but because he kept showing up again and again as exactly who he told me he was. She could let him fix this the easy way, or she could fight to clear her own name herself. And if you'd have chosen the harder path too, like this video right now, because that's exactly the choice I made sitting at that table at 2 a.m. Around 4 a.m, Dante made coffee that neither of us really needed and set a cup down next to my elbow without saying anything, which was somehow more comforting than if he tried to talk me through it. I remember laughing, actually laughing, tired and a little unhinged at the absurdity of building a case against the woman who taught me how to build cases in the first place, using her own methods against her. He didn't laugh with me. He just watched me work, the way you watch someone doing something they're genuinely good at, and told me, quietly, that he'd never seen anyone take a knife out of their own back and use it as a scalpel before. What we found close to dawn was the one thing Diane hadn't accounted for in all her careful planning. A metadata trail on the original leaked files that traced back to a personal device, not a work terminal. Something that couldn't be explained away later as departmental sloppiness or shared login or a careless intern. It was small, technical, almost boring to look at on the screen. It was also the first piece of evidence that could actually hold up under scrutiny. The problem was that metadata alone might not be enough on its own. Not against someone with Diane's standing and decades of goodwill inside that office. We needed her to expose herself, on record, in her own words, saying something no committee could explain away. I proposed going back to her directly, requesting one more off-the-record meeting, walking straight back into the same danger I'd walked into weeks before, except this time I'd be the one setting the trap instead of the one being lured into one. Dante didn't love the idea, and he told me so plainly. But he agreed to monitor from a distance instead of running the operation himself, which was its own kind of trust, letting me run my own play instead of stepping in to handle it for me. The tension in that meeting wasn't physical at all. It was entirely about staying calm enough, precise enough, patient enough to keep her talking on a recorded line long enough to get something specific and damning without ever letting her sense what was actually happening across the table. I used the exact same patience I'd used on those shipping manifests months earlier, sitting in that cold conference room. Except this time the ledger I was auditing was a person, and every question was a routing code I was tracing back to its source. She got comfortable. She got confident, the way people do when they think they've already won. And eventually, carefully, she said enough. The same skill that got her into this mess in the first place was the exact thing about to end it. And Diane had absolutely no idea it was already too late for her. So if you want to see the exact moment she realizes it, stay through to the next part because it happens fast. I watched her face the instant she understood she'd been recorded. All the color left it at once, like someone had pulled a plug somewhere behind her eyes. Dante's people moved in before she could get more than a few steps toward the exit. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no chase. It was just over, quietly, the way these things are supposed to end when they're handled correctly instead of violently. I sat in my car afterward for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. Not out of fear this time. Out of something closer to grief, strange as that sounds for a woman who just helped catch the person who tried to have her killed. I had spent 10 years believing Diane Ashworth was the reason I knew how to be good at my job. I would spend a long time afterward figuring out how much of that belief I gotta keep. With Diane in custody and Reyes formally cleared of everything she tried to pin on him, the case itself resolved faster than I expected it to. But the part nobody warns you about is what comes after the danger actually stops. I had to give a full statement, and it included disclosing my relationship with Dante, which put my actual career on the line one more time. Not because of a villain this time, but because of the ordinary, grinding machinery of the office I'd worked so hard inside of for years, the same machinery that had almost let Diane bury me without a second thought. The internal review board took 4 hours to clear me. 4 hours I spent in a waiting room that smelled like old carpet, rehearsing answers to questions nobody ended up asking. When it was over, the same colleagues who'd avoided eye contact with me for weeks suddenly wanted to shake my hand, and I understood, sitting there accepting congratulations I didn't entirely want, that I was done pretending that building was still the place I belonged. I had to sit with an honest question I hadn't let myself ask directly until then. Whether the career I'd fought so hard to protect was still the exact life I wanted, unchanged, sitting in the same chair doing the same work. Or whether surviving all of this had actually changed what I was willing to build going forward on my own terms this time. That included being honest with Dante, too. Not as someone I now owed something to because he'd helped save my life twice over, but as someone whose world I would be choosing to step into with my eyes fully open, knowing exactly what that would mean for the rest of my life. She saved her own name in the end, through her own work, not because someone did it for her, but I want to know honestly in the comments whether you'd still want the rest of the life that comes with a man like Dante, because that was the real question I had to answer, not whether I'd survive the case, but what I actually wanted once it was over. I turned in my resignation from the prosecutor's office 2 weeks later. Not out of defeat. I started my own independent forensic practice instead, in a small office 3 blocks from my old one, the kind of work where nobody gets to tell me a discrepancy is outside my scope ever again. And for the first time since all of this started, with no danger forcing the moment, no crisis pushing us together, I told Dante Calloway, plainly, standing in his kitchen the way I tell people everything, that I wanted to see where this went. He didn't say much back. He just looked at me the way he had that very first day in his office. Except this time, there was nothing amused or calculating in it all. Just something steady, something that had been there the whole time underneath everything else, waiting for the noise to clear enough that I could actually see it. I think about that first afternoon sometimes, the two of us sizing each other up across his desk like opponents, neither of us having the first idea what we were actually walking into. I think about the version of me who marched into that lobby with a legal pad and a chip on her shoulder, so sure she only needed to be right to be safe. She wasn't wrong to be stubborn. She just hadn't learned yet that being right and being alone don't have to be the same thing. I think that's the part nobody tells you about stories like mine. It isn't the danger that changes you. It's what you choose to build once the danger is finally, completely gone, and nobody is left to make the choice for you but yourself. If this story kept you up later than you meant to stay, subscribe now, because I've got another one waiting for you. And this next woman's discovery is even harder to walk away from than mine was.